Hey, hey, hey! It's AAA Wednesday, which is my weekly Ask Alyssa Anything session where I'm responding to questions you've left in the comments about the publishing industry and how to write a better story. Today's a very special day because Luca's not only behind me on the couch, but completely upside down for unknown reasons. So hopefully he's not too distracting from the amazing questions you all have today. Before we dive in, some housekeeping. I know you've heard me say it 1,000 times, but I've got to say it for any new folk who are joining us. First, if you haven't subscribed already and joined this amazing community of more than 20,000 authors, go ahead and hit that subscribe button. What are you waiting for? Second, while you're down there, just go ahead and hit that thumbs up button because it does things I don't understand with the algorithm and it really does help out my channel. And lastly, if you haven't downloaded my free resource yet, go into the description and go to the link for my free story self-assessment worksheet. I designed this specifically for my YouTube community who have a work in progress but are struggling to see what to do next, where to take the story, if they need to strengthen the characters or the plot or the ending. This worksheet's going to help you feel out your story and understand where its weak points might be. Downloading it is also going to sign you up for my newsletter, where I curate interviews of industry insiders and traditionally published authors, and they are giving some amazing free tips and talking about their own experiences and anecdotes, so you don't want to miss out on everything that they are sharing. I promise it's worth your time. The link to go direct to the newsletter is also in the description. Here's the first question. I'm writing the story of the first women-led revolution in history that's taking place in Iran. Any tips on how I can make it appealing to the Western readers who don't care about other countries? This sounds like amazing content for a story that would certainly be engaging to Western readers. I honestly would not encourage you to write your story in such a way that you are specifically trying to target a certain readership, because that might erode the authenticity of the story. I would want you to feel compelled to tell the story in the way that is authentic to the characters and the setting and the events that you are actually covering in the story, especially if it's based on real life. American publishing houses are not just looking for books that are set in the US, that involve American characters, because readers in America are not just looking for that either. And that goes for the entirety of the Western publishing world, which is often also entwined with the UK publishing landscape in Europe. In fact, we're seeing many cases of authors in other countries having their works translated and then distributed in the UK, Europe, and the US. So I wouldn't approach your story in any specific way if you do envision a broader readership across the Western world for this book. Write the story as authentically as it comes to you, and then you can figure out a publishing plan that makes sense. I will say the one thing to keep in mind is that if you are submitting to US or UK literary agents when you have the draft completed, the manuscript would need to be written in English. That is really the only requirement, I would say, for you to engage with those publishers. Here's another question. When filling out a query manager form, you can only pick one primary genre. Is there a strategy that we should use for picking that one single genre? I saw an agent saying that one primary mistake that authors make is in picking the wrong genre, and the example she gave was picking romance if your book is actually sci-fi romance, because it will actually appeal to sci-fi readers, not romance readers. Is this generally true? And if so, how do we predict these kinds of rules? And why is this a mistake? If the agent reads the book and thinks it's better in a different genre, can't they just tell the author that before offering representation? This is a good question that gets into one of the nuances of querying, particularly using Query Manager, which is increasingly popular among literary agents in the US and UK. The reason that it's so important for you to pick the genre that really does best represent your work is because literary agents, on the flip side, are going to select the genres that they represent. It's absolutely true that you can have a sci-fi novel that incorporates elements of romance, but the expectations for a novel that is just labeled as romance are quite different from the expectations of a novel primarily labeled as sci-fi that can obviously still have a romantic subplot, right? So how do you figure out what those primary genre classifications are that you should use to describe your story when you are pitching literary agents? The way that I would conceptualize breaking this down is thinking about the time the novel is set in, whether it's present day or historical, and then think about the location, whether it is the real world or an imagined world. So let's walk through this. Say that you have a novel that is set in the Great Depression, that's automatically historical fiction. Sure, there might be elements of a mystery or suspense or romance, but ultimately those are secondary genres. It is historical fiction. So you should feel completely comfortable querying a novel that is set in the Great Depression as historical fiction. That would be the genre I would select in Query Manager. Now let's go to the time question and say that it is contemporary. Well, now the next question is it in our real world or is it in an imagined world? If it is in an imagined world, the question is it sci-fi or fantasy? With sci-fi typically being more technologically oriented, more near future-ish, and then fantasy being not necessarily in the future or in the past, but just in a different world altogether. Maybe different types of creatures are involved. If you determine that the book is sci-fi or fantasy, then I would query primarily with those genres as the overarching category. If you're writing in magical realism, I might also consider that the overarching category. Now let's go into the last bucket, which is you are writing in the contemporary world and it is our real world. In this case, you can use the overarching genre contemporary fiction if one of the subgenres does not fit, which would be literary fiction, romance, thriller / suspense / mystery. There are some nuances there that I don't have time to get into today, but that general category, and horror. The question of literary versus one of these other categories or simply commercial fiction really comes down to the spectrum of commercial fiction to literary fiction. I have another video that goes into the nuances of that, so check that out if you're a bit confused on that terminology. I hope that gave you a broad overview of how to conceptualize genre. I know I didn't get into all the nuances and all the genre classifications available on Query Manager. Ultimately, you want to think about those broad general classifications of time and location in terms of the genre, if you are simply trying to identify an overarching genre category. We have time for one more question today. I've recently completed my novel, which is set during the pandemic. My main character was infected with COVID in the early 2020 days when the whole world still didn't know what this was, and she was put on a ventilator for 1 month in a coma. This is her story of survival, what happened when she came home, etc., and the obstacles that came her way as she's regaining her memory and her strength after losing her career and her fiancé. Question: it has taken me 3 years to write this story, only to find out now that publishers don't want a COVID story, as I've been told recently by my developmental editor. Is this true? What if my character had cancer? She'd still be faced with these obstacles. What do I do now? From how you've described your story, I don't think there is any problem in keeping it set in 2020 during the pandemic. There are plenty of novels that are set in 1999, for instance, right before Y2K, because that is a pivotal moment of cultural history and significance, which 2020 and the pandemic certainly is as well. So if there is an integral reason why your story needs to be set in 2020 during the thick of the beginning of the pandemic, then my view is that it absolutely should be set in that time frame, because that is a critical component of the story. Now, if you told me that you're writing a story where it doesn't really matter what year it's set in, it could be 2020 or it could be 2024, and it doesn't affect the characters, then I would say, let's not label the year. But in your case, the 2020 landscape is crucial to the story, and taking that out would actually make you lose something, right? For instance, I've edited novels that take place during 2016 because there was a very charged political landscape at that time, right? So I think that it is totally valid for your novel to take place in a specific time and a specific year and have that be an element of the story. I wouldn't advise you to change that if it transforms your vision for the work. If you have a character who has COVID and is on a ventilator, and that is crucial to her story, then I would encourage you to retain that and retain the setting as it is. Because otherwise you're not doing justice to the story you actually want to tell, right? By changing it and making it something that it isn't at its core. Thank you so much to everyone who submitted a question today. I hope you found this session interesting and helpful. If you did, don't forget to hit that thumbs up button and go ahead and hit that subscribe button if you haven't already. and grab my free story self-assessment worksheet, and check out my newsletter link in the description below. Thanks so much for watching, and happy writing.